second panel, if everyone can take their seats. Thank you so much. Good morning. My name is Doron Ezickson. I'm the head of the Washington office of the Anti-Defamation League, and it is a true privilege to be here today with you, first and foremost to occupy the seat last held by Nancy Kaufman, who is a renowned member of our community and for whom I served on the board of the Boston chapter a quorum or two ago in my prior life. So nice to see you, Nancy, and thank you for all the wonderful work. A very interesting conversation. We're going to have a conversation this morning about a very light topic to start your day, and that is the mainstreaming of hate. And it is, again, our privilege to have with us today, to my right, Cynthia Deitle, who is the Program and Operations Director at the wonderful Matthew Shepard Foundation, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And Amy Spitalnick, who is the Executive Director of Integrity First for America, which some of you may not have heard of before, but which is a legal action organization formed and most notably engaged in litigation to hold the folks in Charlottesville accountable for the hate that we saw on scene there. And so we are here as experts, if you will, warriors in the fight against hate. And I'm not sure if my qualifications in that regard are because I'm at the ADL or because I'm a Patriots fan. Is there some hate out there? Okay, thank you. That will be my last joke for the morning, I promise. But we do want to make this a conversation, and so on your tables there are cards. If, as we are engaged in our repartee among ourselves, questions come up, please do jot them down. You can hand them to staff at any point, and we will reserve time at the end to collate those questions and to respond. I don't think anybody here is unaware of developments in the last 2 to 3 years that bring us here with this topic this morning, the mainstreaming of hate. We at the ADL are full-time engaged, and I want to say in wonderful partnership with CRCs across the country. I have the privilege of working on a daily basis with my JCRC partners in the greater Washington area, Ron Halber and Darcy Hirsch and others, in Baltimore with Howard Libet, across Virginia, Virginia Beach with Robin Mancole and others, in Richmond, in Charlotte, in Raleigh-Durham and other communities, and many other communities. And it's a partnership that is necessary. We try to bring expertise and tools and analysis to engage in the fight against hate, but we need to do so in partnership with you and your expertise in the local communities that you serve, and with the advantage of the coalitions that you maintain on a daily basis in your community. So I thank you for that partnership and look forward to continuing that across the country. The statistics are somewhat dire, but I will say that we are going to share with you some degree of hope today as well, and some reflections on what gives us hope in our work every day. The recent FBI statistics on hate crimes, which is a actually small subcategory of the overall number of hate incidents that occur, and it goes without saying, are also, we know, vastly underreported. Notwithstanding that, we now saw the third successive year of an increase in hate crimes across the United States. These were the 2017 numbers that came out recently. Again, as was in the recent past, the largest category of hate was on the basis of race. The largest group of victims in that regard were African Americans. The second largest category was on the basis of religion. The largest number of incidents against the Jewish community. The fastest growing category in 16, and it continued somewhat in 17, was against Muslim Americans. Some of the most violent crime, horrifically, is against the LGBTQ community, particularly the trans community, where we saw an increase, a very troubling increase in the number of murders. And these, again, are just the hate crimes, and only for those departments that report, which are a minority of large departments across the country. So we have an infrastructure issue about, do we even really know the extent of the problem? But what we do know is trending in a very particular direction. Those numbers were validated or pre-validated, if you will, with the anti-Semitism audit that we at AEDL conduct every year. We had announced, as I'm sure you're aware, a 57% increase in anti-Semitic incidents reported to us. I want to note that the most troubling statistic for me in that was not just the 57%, but that we saw a near 100% increase in hate incidents in K through 12 schools and on college campuses. So when we think about the mainstreaming of hate, we need to understand that what is out there, what we fight every day, the language that we bemoan, the leadership that we seek, actually is having a local impact. And what we need to think about are strategies to intervene and ensure that we are not creating yet another generation of folks with hateful outlooks about one another. And so that's setting the stage that we are in a serious period of escalated expression of hate, to some degree permission being given. Let me turn to our panelists for some initial reflections from their perspective. And again, rather than do formal introductions, I'm going to ask each of you to begin talking a bit about your own journey to the position you're in, what brought you there, and what keeps you there, if you will. Cynthia.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. You're still awake. I want to thank JCPA for inviting me, for you for moderating our panel this morning, and for all of you for coming out and listening and participating and engaging. Please fill out the note cards, ask questions. It makes this more engaging and more fulfilling, I know, for me to hear from all of you instead of the opposite. I am the program director for the Matthew Shepard Foundation, and I joined the Matthew Shepard Foundation in 2017 after I retired from the FBI. I served as a special agent with the FBI for 22 years, 20 of which was focused on our civil rights program, which encompasses hate crime and police brutality, most notably. I got into the FBI to only work that violation, which I know is a bit strange. But that's where I felt I could do the best work and be the best FBI agent, was to fight for the rights of people that couldn't fight for their own rights, and to give people voice, and to give people justice who deserved it. I met Dennis and Judy Shepard, who I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, at the signing of the Shepard-Byrd Law at the White House almost 10 years ago. And I was completely captivated by these two people who turned their grief and their tragedy into a loud and pronounced and successful voice, not just for the LGBTQ community, but for anyone who faces racism or bigotry or discrimination. And I was so honored to work with them in the last several years of my career, conducting hate crime trainings in many different cities and states across the country, and trying to train not only law enforcement, but just private citizens about what they could do, in our words, to erase hate. So after the election in 2016, do you all know about the election in 2000? And does that at all? What is she talking about? I think I knew that I wanted to do more. I felt like I was not doing enough and I wanted to do more. So I needed a new work home. The foundation needed a program director, and there it was. So what I do for the foundation is a lot of what I did with the FBI. I do a lot of hate crime training. I do a lot of these types of events, and try to get all of you, which I guess I'm speaking to the choir here, but all of you engaged and passionate about whatever it is you're calling in your mission to help those who need uplifting. And I feel very fortunate to be able to do that.
Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. So I'm the executive director of an organization called Integrity First for America, which is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization that's dedicated to holding those accountable who violate long-standing principles of our democracy, civil rights, equal justice, and so on. And you might not know about IFA yet, even though we're going to change that. But you might know about the lawsuit that we support, which is a lawsuit filed in fall 2017 against 24 defendants who are the Nazis and white supremacists who attacked Charlottesville in August 2017. Thanks. The lawsuit is being led by our lead counsels, Robbie Kaplan and Karen Dunn. So the fact that this is a lawsuit that's spearheaded by 3 short, loud Jewish women is not something that our defendants particularly like, but we're very proud to be doing it. But to backtrack a little bit, I joined IFA a couple months ago after over a decade working in government, politics, and advocacy, particularly on the local and state level. I worked for the New York Attorney General and for the New York City Mayor. And for me, this is a deeply personal issue to be working on. I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and growing up, the Holocaust and anti-Semitism seemed like something that was far away, that we had overcome, that we really sort of looked at as a history lesson rather than as something that we needed to be thinking about for the future and for the current day. So the fact that here we are in 2019 and we need to be suing Nazis is not something that I ever expected to be doing, but of course it's deeply meaningful to be doing. Our lawsuit is headed to trial this year in July in the Western District of Virginia. It's going to be a jury trial. This comes after major wins in court by our legal team, including beating back a motion to dismiss filed by the defendants last year. The judge made clear that they're standing here and that we're going to be moving forward, and also winning a number of orders from the court requiring the defendants to turn over, for instance, their social media accounts and their personal devices for forensic imaging. So this is something that's moving full speed ahead. We're headed to trial, like I said, in July, and I look forward to sort of sharing a bit more about the lawsuit and how it fits into this broader effort to really tackle the mainstreaming of hate.
Thank you. So we will talk about tactics and tools because that is critical in the fight, obviously, but let's talk a little bit more about the prognosis. And I think it's obvious that we're discussing this, and I hope it's obvious, we're discussing this in an entirely non-partisan way. I think it's critical to the credibility of the conversation that we acknowledge that there is hate, unfortunately, arising in various parts of our society. It is not unipolar. It unfortunately happens on poles in general and on both sides. Obviously, the increase in violence and in extremism on the right has merited attention, and we will focus on that for good reason. But let me say that we should not ignore that which is emerging in response either, in terms of justifying violence to oppose the ideology of hate or other forms of hate, and the critical importance that all civil rights leadership and all leaders of all organizations that are engaged in communal activity are able to call out the hate when they see it, regardless of where it arises. So we're talking about mainstreaming. Cynthia, what does mainstream hate mean to you? What has changed, if anything, from your long experience in fighting this, both within law enforcement and now within the nonprofit community? Is there something different? Is there something that's more mainstream about the hate today than looking back?
I think probably any of you could give this answer. I don't know that it takes a former FBI agent to figure this out, but I started investigating hate crimes in 1997. That's before the explosion of social media. In fact, if we ever found a defendant's or a suspect's MySpace, remember that? MySpace account, we were related. That was so great. But there wasn't social media. And hate at that time was in the shadows. Now looking back, that's what I can see now, is it was happening in those other neighborhoods. It was happening somewhere else. And when it bubbled up, it usually was amongst someone who was young, someone who needed alcohol to get up enough nerve to do something horrific, like spray paint a swastika on a synagogue or attack someone outside of a gay bar. They needed that liquid courage, and they needed to find some other people to go along with them. And we saw a lot of young folks that went down these bad roads because of a lot of torment and tragedy that happened to themselves when they were children. and how they were bullied or they were beaten up by their father or something like that. It was just these sporadic bubbles up of hate that we saw back in the 90s and early 2000s. Now what we see is what you all see. You don't need a drink before you go out and express your hate through violence. You don't need to convince others or find others in high school or out at a car wash somewhere that believe what you believe, but we don't want to talk about it because other people don't like it. You don't see that now. Now it's very much in the open. And it's very accepted amongst a big, frightening chunk of our population. That's what I see now, is they have this very frightening courage to be emboldened enough to express their hate in a very accepted way. And that's very frightening. And what frightens me more is, even if there is a change in our administration, even if there is a groundswell amongst all of you and amongst us to try to expose this hate for what it is, how do you convince young people who saw this bubbling up for the last few years, how do you convince them that that's not okay, when it seemed to be okay, because it was so prevalent and it was so widespread and so out in the open? So it has changed. I think, like anybody, we all, if you're young, if you're in school, you follow a leader, whether that leader is your teacher or your principal or your parents, you follow a leader. Some people follow a leader like the President of the United States, or their senators or their congresspeople. You follow a leader, and when that leader is spewing hate and vitriol, that's going to take some time to turn that around. So I think it's a tribute to the work that all of you do in your communities to try to expose it and to crush it.
I totally agree, and I think the word emboldened is exactly right. The thing that I want to add here is that the defendants in the Charlottesville suit actually all conspired for months leading up to Charlottesville on a platform called Discord. Discord is a site that's typically used by people who play video games, gamers as they're known. But the defendants here, through reams and reams of transcripts that we were able to get our hands on, actually plotted online for months to conspire and commit the violence that we saw in August 2017. So previously, people who had these beliefs, who wanted to do something like this, might not have been able to necessarily find each other and connect, but what's changed in recent years because of, sort of the blessing and the curse of our new digital world is that they are able to find each other. And they had, it's really unbelievable sort of the ways in which they were able to do this, which they had channels on everything from the types of weapons they would bring, where they talked about bags filled with coins or different things like that that they would use to attack counter-protesters, to even the most mundane things like what sort of sprouted gluten-free bread they should bring and whether they should put mayonnaise on their sandwiches or in case it would go bad, because this was sort of how detailed this was and how perfectly planned in advance it was. And so particularly, as Cynthia said, as we sort of look at this emboldened white supremacist, white nationalist movement that we're grappling right now, there is this layer of the new digital world in which they could operate that made things possible that weren't 10, 15 years ago.
And so let's talk more about the role of social media, and also you mentioned the role of leadership. Attitudes towards others, according to polls, have been mixed over many decades. And we certainly know from history's perspective that when you have economic anxiety or actual anxiety about fear for your children, for your community, and the dislocation, some have cited trade and globalism as being highly dislocated to communities, traditional communities here in the United States. Who are we in conversation with? We know who the haters are who adopt the ideology, but part of mainstreaming is the process by which larger and larger groups of people are willing to buy into the symbolism, the tropes. We certainly see in the Jewish community the number of conspiracy theories that have arisen both on the left and the right to describe Jewish power and the role of Jews, including tragically in Pittsburgh, where, again, this toxic combination of fear and the internet enabled somebody to believe that Jews were behind the caravan and were intending to do harm. Where is the conversation with folks that might be people of goodwill but were afraid and who don't have an alternative ideology?
Someone on the last panel talked about being very mindful with their social media postings, and even if you participate in the Women's March or what you do in your day-to-day life, being very mindful about what is your narrative and what is your message. So if you use social media to just simply repost or retweet articles that are pronouncing the hate or showing off the hate. So she was talking about you keep posting the picture of the swastika on the synagogue or a mass shooting, and all of your posts, probably not intentionally, are just giving more attention to the hate instead of the good. That's what's going to keep your page alive. That's the message you're sending, is look at this hate over here, look at this hate. Or if you turn that around and you say, hey, look what this little first grader did with her profits from a bake sale, and she gave it to the local homeless shelter. Uplift that. Make that your narrative. Make your narrative and your message something positive. Every time you retweet and you repost something that's hateful, even though you're trying to draw attention to all the hate that's out there, I understand that, it keeps all of that very much in the news. Where if you turn it around, I think the messages that will continue and that will resonate with families are the ones that are positive and uplifting. And I think that's how you change the ideology around. How many of you have, okay, show of hands, this is engaging, okay, ready? Okay, how many of you have participated in some type of march? Okay, that's fantastic. How many of you have children? How many of you took your kids to your march? Love it. Exactly, that's what
How about my
you do.
grandchildren?
Grandchildren! Wait, I put my hand out for that one. Okay.
Do I hear great-grandchildren?
Great-grandchildren? Nieces? Yep, okay, we'll stop. But that's the point, right? Is you're showing your children, your grandchildren, I'm using my voice and my time to show my opinion because I want to spread the good and the love. And that's why we do it. That's how you start changing that narrative around.
I think that's right. And I think the other thing that we need to recognize, particularly as a community, which I'm very heartened to see be a big part of the conversation this week and in general right now, is that, you know, these guys on the other side, they hate all of us. They hate us for our skin color, they hate people because of their religion, they hate people because of their sexual orientation, their gender. And we saw that in Charlottesville, we see that in the many other horrible, hate-filled incidents over the last few years, including in Pittsburgh, where the shooter attacked the Pittsburgh Jewish community because they were helping immigrants. And, you know, I hate to use the word intersectional in this way, but they are very intersectional in their hate. They hate all of us. They might be motivated by individual factors, but at the end of the day, they are out there storming Charlottesville, attacking our communities because they hate anyone who sort of is different than their vision for what this country should look like. And all of us in this room are different than what that vision is. And so we need to be mindful of that, and we need to be intersectional in our own approach to fighting this. We're not going to beat the white nationalist movement, the white supremacist movement, anti-Semitism simply by focusing on anti-Semitism, but we have to focus on racism, on homophobia, on misogyny, on everything else that really motivates these guys.
I've heard it said that the haters don't discriminate. It's another way to think about it.
And I think they hate amongst themselves too. So if you spend a lot of time looking at some of the dialogue within that white nationalist, white supremacist movement, you'll see how there's so much discord amongst themselves. So they might have sort of a common mission and goal, but even when you dig really down deep, a lot of them hate each other for, you didn't go to the last march, you didn't march with a loud enough voice, you wore the wrong, I told you to wear this color shirt, you didn't. You see a lot of just all-consuming
hatred, even amongst groups of people that you would think would all get along. And I always hope that that hate would just self-destroy those types of organizations, because it is true, when you're so consumed by hate, it is all-encompassing and all-destructive.
So let's look at the flip side of hate, and that is that it has our attention. It has the media's attention, it has many of our leaders' attention. It's part of the conversation, I think, on a regular basis. And with that attention, perhaps there lies an opportunity. With my personal background, which is in law, I have a lot of belief in our institutions. I think our institutions are being tested. But let's talk about the infrastructure that we have within our institutions of government to combat hate and the kind of resource that's necessary, and maybe how we can engage in coalition with some of the work that you do. So let's talk about an area, Cynthia, that you and we at the ADL share a lot on and cooperate on, which is providing law enforcement the understanding, the tools, the infrastructure to respond to hate appropriately. Talk a little bit about that and the importance of it.
So the FBI, in my humble opinion, now that I've left, we would not, sorry, I can't use that pronoun anymore, they would not be as successful were it not partnerships and liaisons and collaborations with folks like you. So it is very well known that the FBI and the Department of Justice and many local and state law enforcement agencies have very solidified partnerships with the ADL, for example. Michael Lieberman, are you still here? There he is. So Michael Lieberman, dear friend and colleague of mine, we started working together when I was chief of the civil rights unit in the FBI headquarters. And we had so many conversations and meetings and collaborative efforts to try to figure out how we could force multiply each other to combat hate as it would appear in a variety of forms. And that's how the FBI is successful, that's how law enforcement is successful, is when private citizens give information to the FBI, when they collaborate and they say, hey, I got a weird posting on my Facebook page, will you take a look at this? Or I think there is going to be a Unite the Right rally in my community, let's collaborate to make sure that everybody at that space is safe. So the protesters, the counter-protesters, the law enforcement agents, the business owners in that community, that everybody is safe and that it's done within the bounds of the law, that rally. So collaboration, partnership, transparency is key. Governments like the FBI, government agencies like the FBI and the Department of Justice have to be transparent and genuine in what they give back and how they behave, so that folks like you will trust them to do the right things. Questions, stacks of questions. Thank you. Are they easy? Okay, off the top. I will turn it over to you. But I think that's, those partnerships have to be sustained, have to be cultured and developed and capitalized on to keep everybody safe.
I think, again, I think that's right. We're in a lot of agreement here. And I think that we as sort of private communities in a way have a role as well. So the plaintiffs in the Charlottesville lawsuit are a coalition of students, clergy, community members who were impacted by the violence. You might know the Pulitzer-winning photo of this African-American man pushing a woman out of the way of the car. He sprawled across the front of the car. It's Marcus and Marissa. They are two of the plaintiffs in the suit. Were obviously injured by the car that killed Heather Heyer and injured many more. And these very brave, courageous plaintiffs have put their name on this suit because in and of it, like law enforcement in and of itself wasn't going to be able to make the forward movement on this issue that we felt was necessary, which is that there was a conspiracy to commit violence here. The suit is under something called the KKK Act of 1871, which was passed by the Reconstructionist Congress as a way to protect communities against post-Civil War violence. It obviously has not had to be used very frequently in recent years. I think one of the more recent uses was during Freedom Rides. So, needless to say, we're dealing with a somewhat unique situation, but at the same time, the fact that, law enforcement on their own is certainly prosecuting. I think everyone knows that James Field, who drove the car, was convicted of murder. But at the same time, there needs to be, or we felt there needed to be additional forward movement here. And in this case, a suit that would send a clear message, create a strong legal precedent, and help deter future acts like this. So having that sort of balance between law enforcement and people who are willing in their private capacities to do something that I think is pretty brave and courageous, which is put their name on a suit like this, is really important.
Let's stay with law enforcement for a few minutes. Law enforcement is appropriately and often called out when engaged in ongoing activity or failure to respond appropriately or even to commit violence. That has certainly been a theme, and the ongoing issues relating to criminal justice reform and community policing are very real. Do we, in fairness, however, give law enforcement, as part of their routine training on an ongoing basis, the tools to both understand how hate manifests itself and the importance of their role in making people feel safe regardless of their identity?
The ADL does a masterful job of training federal, state, and local law enforcement officials to understand the origins of hate and to know how to combat it, to know how to attack it from a legal perspective. They do an excellent job, and the Matthew Shepard Foundation and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights have partnered with the ADL in numerous cities to effectuate these trainings. What we found is, in engaging with so many law enforcement officials, is they have never received training on, would you know a hate crime when you saw it? If you respond to a call for service outside of a bar that is known to be frequented by the LGBT community and it's an assault, are you going to put those two things together? Are you going to ask the victim what was said, if anything, during the attack? Are you going to know it when you see it? And sadly, there is a lack of training. It's very apparent, a lack of training for local law enforcement officials to just simply know a hate crime when they see it. And even if they put two and two together and they say, okay, this is a synagogue, that's a swastika on the synagogue, I get where those two things go together, I understand that. Are you going to know how to then investigate that and prove that bias motivation? That's key. If you're trying to convict someone for violating a local hate crime statute, do you know how to prove that bias motivation? A very sad lack of training on that issue. And the other part of this is, even if the law enforcement officials do everything right and get it and go to social media and get the evidence of bias, are they in alignment with their prosecutor's office? Is that local assistant district attorney going to say, I don't need that, I don't need to know the bias, we can just do simple assault, simple vandalism, and this case is over? Or is the ADA saying, this is fantastic, I want to prove that bias motivation, I want that to be in court, I want that to be part of this case? Because what that then does is it vindicates the victim. I wasn't just assaulted because I happened to be standing where I was. I was assaulted because of who I am. That's not okay. So if the victim feels comfortable with the law enforcement agency to say, this is what happened to me, and that law enforcement agency says, I get it, I understand what this is, and the prosecutor is also in alignment, and then when this is all over, you circle back to that law enforcement official who then reports that incident to the FBI's Uniform Crime Report as a hate crime, the circle is complete. And that's the one thing that we're trying to do with the Matthew Shepard Foundation and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and the ADL, is to make sure that everybody's local law enforcement agencies have that training, that they know when they see it, and they're aligned with their assistant district attorneys, and they can complete that circle.
before I joined Integrity First for America, I was a senior advisor to the New York Attorney General, and I think, as we've been talking about, obviously in the last couple of years, there's been an alarming rise in hate crimes, and we found that local police departments around New York did not have the resources or the tools to actually identify the hate crimes and do exactly what Cynthia described. So we put together guidance in late 2016 after that sort of first uptick that we saw, working in concert with, I believe, the JCRC in New York, a number of other partners from all different backgrounds, and provided a written hate crimes guidance to these local police departments and local prosecutors and other folks so that they could answer those questions and actually make sure people are being held accountable for hate crimes. But not every state has an attorney general that will necessarily do that. And I think, again, that makes it all the more important to have folks like you working in your communities to connect those dots and make sure that this is happening.
So that is a sort of a takeaway as a practical matter, that while we have hate crime legislation that was written some time ago by a team of folks, including the aforementioned Mr. Lieberman, that is now adopted in one form or another in 45 states. It is not equal. There are variations in terms of remedies, in terms of resources. We know that reporting is still vastly lower than what is capable. That's what is actually happening. That's sometimes information, sometimes it's vulnerable communities who do not trust law enforcement. There's work to be done there in terms of empowering folks and figuring out mechanisms in your local communities. The legislation can be improved, and then quite frankly, law enforcement oftentimes, even if they have good intention, they have resource limitations as a practical matter, which impede their ability both to get training on a continuous basis. Their ranks continue to change. But also the resources on a very localized basis in terms of response, investigation. This is an added complexity. The importance of this cannot be understated. It's both for the reason that it is anti-democratic to suggest that somebody can get away with a crime on the basis of your identity when we are a country of individual rights, but it's also so because it's a crime against the community writ large. That if you seek to disenfranchise one person on the basis of their identity, you're sending that message more broadly. So we have the idea of here responding to the hate and empowering the law enforcement. Another mechanism for trying to control the hate is to understand who the haters are and to attach yet another price to their conduct, which is what the litigation is meant to do. What has been the reaction so far? Give us just a quick sense of who the defendants are, if you will, and what you're learning in the process. How are they responding to being held civilly accountable for their actions?
They're not responding well, I will tell you that. So the lawsuit was originally filed in October 2017 by this coalition of Charlottesville community members who were injured in some way, whether it was on that first night of Charlottesville where we saw the Nazis and white supremacists marching with tiki torches, chanting things like "Jews will not replace us" or "blood and soil," which I think many of you know is a Holocaust trope. And in some cases, they literally surrounded, there were students and other members of the UVA community that surrounded, I believe it was the Jefferson statue on campus to sort of protect it from the protesters. They had things like fuel, other unknown liquids thrown on them, tiki torches waved. Obviously, if you are someone in the center of a circle of Nazis and white supremacists, that is terrifying. And then, of course, the following day there was the march and ultimately the car driven by Fields into the crowd of protesters, which killed Heather Heyer and injured many more. So there were a number of people in this community who were directly impacted, physically, emotionally, and otherwise. The defendants are a coalition of 24 Nazis and white supremacists. Some of them you might know, like Richard Spencer, Jason Kessler, Chris Cantwell, who's known as the crying Nazi. And others are groups, white nationalist groups, including, for instance, Identity Europa, which I believe is responsible for about 60% of sort of a lot of white nationalist anti-Semitic propaganda on college campuses, according to some recent stats. So I think some of these individuals and groups you might have heard of, others you might not know, but you you certainly know their hateful work. They filed a motion to dismiss after the lawsuit was filed, arguing that this is their First Amendment right. It's their First Amendment right to conspire to commit violence against people. We argued, nope, the First Amendment does not protect you. Much like if you were conspiring to rob a bank, you can't conspire to actually harm people, including based on who they are, what they look like, and what they believe. And the judge agreed with us. So a couple months back, the judge threw out their motion to dismiss. And I think, as I mentioned, has also issued a number of orders requiring them to turn over devices and social media for forensic imaging. And we're right now in this critical evidence discovery portion of the trial, of the case. The trial is scheduled for July, which is quite soon. I think it is clear that the judge is looking to move on pretty quick timeline. It's a jury trial in the Western District of Virginia. I will say, though, that even though it's clear that these defendants did not bring their motion to dismiss, that the justice system is working as it should be, and this case is moving forward, these defendants don't like it very much, and they particularly don't like the fact that there's a coalition of, as I mentioned, Jewish women who are leading this litigation against them. And they have really said the most obscene, vile things and threatened us in the most obscene and vile ways. For instance, sending things online to Robbie Kaplan saying something must be done about Roberta Kaplan, sending us images of ovens from the concentration camps. The stuff that I guess you would imagine that they would do, but when you receive that, needless to say, for our legal team, for our plaintiffs, it's disturbing, but it's not going to dissuade us from moving forward. So that's where it stands. I think there's a lot more to talk about in terms of what the meat of the case is, some of the things that we saw in Charlottesville during that weekend in August 2017, but I'll leave it there for now.
Let's talk a little bit more about social media. It's come up and we have several questions oriented to this because there's a bit of a dilemma. And I think, Cynthia, you referenced it in terms of the messaging and how much do we put out a message of hope. We know that this trolling that occurs, our first experience in recent time, for those of you who may remember, there was an African-American student body president, the first female African-American student body president elected at American University a year and a half ago. The day after her election, a series of nooses was hung around her sorority with bananas and racial epithets. That was followed immediately by an attempt to troll her, which the Center on Extremism at ADL was able to identify and to warn the university and her about. Taylor Thompson is her name. The threat, the type of vile, hideous threats that came her way, her family's way, it happened to the mayor of Charlottesville back in April after the first Tiki Torch March, where the mayor, who happens to be Jewish, was threatened as images of his 2-year-old children and his wife were used, and again, horrific. So this goes on and law enforcement responds and we need to deal with it. What is the balance between calling out attention to these acts and alternatively using a positive message of coalition, as you referred to? Is there anything further, Cynthia, that you would point us to as by way of example as to how to utilize the attention drawn by the hate to actually reveal positive messages that allow us to move forward?
Well, I would be remiss if I did not say that the FBI law enforcement is obviously very protective of these types of situations. So if you feel like you posted something or you are an attorney or a plaintiff in a case such as yours, and you see on social media that there are these threatening communications, that could very well violate federal law. And I would definitely encourage any of you that receive a threatening communication like that on social media, by phone, by email, to make law enforcement aware of that. And I say that, one, for your safety, and two, because you never know what else the FBI knows about the person who just sent that communication to you. So it could be that that person has been sending a whole lot of other communications to people, and now the totality of that situation has crossed the line where it is actionable under federal law. So I would encourage anybody who feels like they've been threatened to definitely notify law enforcement about that. There is a very tenuous balance between calling somebody out for who they are and trying to spread a message of acceptance and inclusion and love. And I think it's almost up to each of you as to how you want to turn that around. So you want to point out, let's say if someone in the audience here wants to point out something that happened, and you want to turn it into a message of love. I think that's the way to do it. I always cringe when I see something on social media that is just the hateful action. It's just the repost and there's nothing else to that. I love when I see something about a repost of something horrible that's happened, even if it's just something local that maybe didn't make CNN, but something that happened in your community and you put that on your social media feed and you put it in such a way as look at what has happened and then look at what my community or my family or my school is doing to call out that behavior and then to respond in a positive way. That's what I love. I love when someone just takes the time to say, okay, this is what happened and this is what I did about it. That's that advocacy, that's that I'm going to the next step page that I hope all of you, and I know all of you, with your connections and the work that you do, that is something that I know you're all doing in your day-to-day lives, and I would encourage you to do more of that. That if you're going to repost something or you're going to use social media to call out something, make sure you couch that in what did you do about it, and how did you counter that with acceptance and inclusion and with love.
And Amy, how much of what you're doing is meant to educate people? In other words, is that part of the strategy here, that by putting out what happened in Charlottesville and holding folks accountable in a public forum, that part of this is to expose the process, expose the ideology?
I think that's right. And so IFA's work is certainly about legal action, but also about education and accountability. And I'd say that there are sort of three main things that we hope and that we've already begun to accomplish from this litigation. I think one is a legal precedent, setting a clear message through the courts that you cannot conspire to commit racialized violence. The KKK Act blocks this. We haven't needed to use it in some time, but it's something that is not allowed under law. And it's just not something that has any place in our community. And I think one thing that I want to note on that front is that while Charlottesville was a flashpoint, it was not an isolated incident. It is not something that happened in a vacuum. We saw it in Pittsburgh. We saw it in Kentucky with the supermarket shootings there. We saw it a few weeks ago with the Jussie Smollett attack. This is a real crisis that we're facing. So, and in fact, actually, Robert Bowers, the shooter in Pittsburgh, communicated with some of the defendants in our lawsuit on a platform called Gab in the months leading up to the shooting. So again, this is not something that's happening in a vacuum. And so making clear that there's a clear legal precedent against this sort of conspiracy to commit racialized violence is important. But it also serves as a deterrent. And we've already seen, so Charlottesville happened in August 2017. In summer 2018, where when some of the defendants were trying to organize another rally, another Unite the Right, some of the other defendants said, we really don't want to be sued again. And that in and of itself is immensely powerful, and in some ways we feel like we've already been successful with this lawsuit. And then finally, also, in addition to the accountability, the education, all of the things that I just walked through, the suit also has the potential to sort of make sort of financially bankrupt this movement in a lot of ways. What we're seeking here are civil penalties. This is a civil suit. Obviously, we ourselves can't put these guys in prison. We're not federal or state prosecutors. But what we can do is make sure that they're held accountable through the civil system. And we're seeking extensive civil damages. And again, whether it's about deterrence or education or some combination, these things already have had an impact, and certainly if and when we win in court, will continue to have an impact in stopping this sort of conspiracy and violence.
So I'm getting the signal that we're almost done, and I apologize to folks who gave questions. I tried to integrate a couple of them. I apologize that we're already running out of time, and I know that there were a number of questions about where we fit on the political spectrum and the idea that, is there a distinction between anti-Semitism or hate on the left versus the right, and do we call it out enough? I'm happy to take those questions sidebar if you'd like to engage in a conversation about that. I think it's a very important topic and one that merits, further analysis. We, again, were asked to explore a particular type of hate today, which resides mostly on the right. That does not suggest that we don't have very serious problems. As I said in my opening comments, particularly as it relates to tropes and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that exist increasingly on the left. But let me start with a question about hope, which I promised we would get back to, and that is, what gives you hope in the fight? We talk about education, we talk about coalitions. Cynthia, what, in your years of doing this, are we moving in a positive direction, and what gives you hope that we are?
Kids. Kids give me hope. When I see, and you've all seen this, the Parkland kids, but when you see young people moved to action, that's going to bring me to tears every day of the week. And it doesn't matter what their cause is, really. I mean, I know it's a good one, but it doesn't matter what their cause is. If they have been affected by something and they are moved to do something positive because of it, that's what gives me hope. I would highly doubt that if you are impacted by something in your life at a young age and you then spring into action, I doubt that that's going to end at some point. They're never going to forget that. For me, I grew up in Ohio and not too far away from Kent State University. And when I was a kid, is that a clap? That's awesome. Go Bucks, okay. And I wrote my first paper as a 7th grader on the Kent State shooting. And just, all I remember is thinking back at the ripe old age of, how old are you when you're in 7th grade, or 13 years old? I remember thinking, this is horrible. There can't be anything worse than this, where you have a government actor slaughtering college kids. That's the worst thing that could possibly happen. For me, that was the worst thing that could possibly happen. And that impacted the rest of my life. And all I wanted to do was to help those people that were impacted by hate or by government misbehavior or illegal activity, to help them. And that shaped who I became. That didn't end at some point. It just magnified itself into going into public service for the FBI. So I know there's more of me and more of you and more of all of you out there. And what we can do is to find those 7th graders and uplift them and give them a magnified voice so they really can make that change.
I think there's a lot more of us than there are of them, even if they're the ones who are loudest on Discord or Gap or whatever awful social media platforms they're using these days. The thing that I would add to that is the rule of law. It's giving me hope. I think, right now it's very easy to be scared. It's very easy to feel frustrated about what's happening in our country, but the courts have proven to be doing their jobs in a lot of ways. It's not always going to go the way we want, but I think in this case, certainly in a number of the cases I worked on in my last job, where we were talking about sort of racial animus and a lot of the same sort of themes as we're talking about now. The courts are working, and they are ensuring that there's justice and accountability. They're not always going to go the way we want, but we have a system, a government system of justice that is supposed to provide recourse here for people who are harmed in some way, and that's exactly what's happening in this case, and I expect that it'll continue to.
Thank you, and I'll just add 2 words. What gives me hope is all of you and the coalitions that you work in your communities. One ask of you is that you reflect on how we can remove this delegitimization of people with whom we disagree with from our discourse. We are in highly polarized political times. We are polarized in so many different ways as communities. And I think we have to understand that actually the majority of Americans are people of goodwill, of good faith, willing to engage in conversation. And if we can restore our ability to not reject people on the basis of what they believe, but actually reflect on and get to know who they are, then maybe we will bring back in a much more expeditious way the majority of folks and their voice that will overcome the hate that is at the extremes. We thank you for listening and look forward to your questions offline. Thank you.